Why Aprilia failed in motocross. In 2009, Aprilia showed up to motocross with a V-twin, a dedicated motocross machine built to line up on a gate against KTM, Honda, and Yamaha and win. The bike was the MXV450. It had a 77-degree liquid-cooled V-twin, fuel injection, 2 ignition maps, and a price tag of $8,499. It also had one problem that no amount of engineering could fix. The AMA banned it before it ever turned a competitive lap on American soil. Every serious motocross manufacturer in 2009 was building the same basic engine, a single-cylinder 454-stroke, compact, centralized, and refined through a decade of 4-stroke rule changes that had pushed the entire industry in the same direction. Aprilia looked at that consensus and built a 77-degree V-twin instead. The engine displaced 449 cubic centimeters, split across 2 cylinders, fed by 238mm Dell'Orto throttle bodies, and used dry sump lubrication with the oil tank integrated into the crankcase, a packaging solution that kept the engine surprisingly compact. The gearbox had its own separate lubrication circuit. The heads ran a single overhead cam driving 4 valves per cylinder with titanium valves to keep reciprocating mass down. On a spec sheet, this reads like a road racing motor that took a wrong turn at the factory gate. On a motocross track, it felt like nothing else in the paddock. The firing interval is what defined the riding experience. A single-cylinder 450 fires once per crankshaft revolution, one large, violent combustion event that produces the hit-and-hang power character MX riders either love or spend their entire setup budget trying to manage. The MXV's twin firing interval meant 2 smaller combustion events per revolution, which smoothed the power pulse frequency and produced a linear, progressive throttle response that testers consistently described as controlled, confidence-building, and genuinely fast. One dirt rider tester called it a silken monster, linear and smooth through the mid-range, then explosive on top with an overrev that kept pulling past the point where most 450 singles sign off. Big Bang versus Screamer, a feature no other MX bike had. Aprilia built 2 ignition timing configurations into the MXV and let the rider choose between them. The Big Bang setting fired both cylinders in a tighter, more clustered interval, similar in concept to the Big Bang firing order Yamaha had used in GP road racing to improve rear traction by reducing the rotational impulse on the drive wheel. On the MXV, it translated to better grip in slick or loose conditions, a more forgiving power delivery, and a bike that was easier to keep hooked up through rutted corners. The Screamer setting spread the firing interval back out, sharpened the hit, and gave the top end more aggression, closer to the character of a conventional single when you needed outright drive. Add the hard and soft fuel maps on top of that, and the MXV was offering 4 distinct power personalities from the factory, without touching a jet kit or swapping an exhaust. In 2009, no other motocross bike on the market could do that. The engineers faced a major problem with this bike, a weight problem. Aprilia claimed 250 pounds dry. Real-world testing put the number closer to 270 pounds. The competition, KTM's 450 SXF, Honda's CRF 450R, Yamaha's YZ 450F, was running race-ready in the 225 to 235 pound range. That's a 35 to 45 pound gap, and in motocross, it's not an abstract number. It's the difference in how the bike loads a jump face, how hard it hits the landing, how quickly it changes direction in a rhythm section, and how much energy a rider burns, muscling it through braking bumps lap after lap. The MXV's 50mm Marzocchi upside-down forks and Sachs shock were both quality components, and Aprilia revalved and reset the fork settings for the 2009 model year to better handle the chassis dynamics of a heavier bike. But suspension setup can compensate for weight to a point. It can't eliminate it. And on an MX track where every gram matters, the MXV was carrying a penalty it couldn't spend its way out of. Another major problem for the riders, the geometry problem on the ground and in the air. The V-twin's physical footprint introduced a chassis compromise that showed up in 2 specific situations. At the foot pegs, the MXV ran wider than a single, not dramatically, but enough that in deep ruts the cases would drag when the suspension was fully loaded. Riders who tested the bike documented skid plate contact on landings, which on a motocross track isn't occasional, it's every single double and triple on the circuit. The skid plate contact wasn't catastrophic, but it told you something important. The engine architecture was fighting the chassis dimensions that MX geometry demands. The second problem was visible in the air. Mid-air correction on a motocross bike relies on being able to shift your weight, tap the rear brake, or blip the throttle to adjust the bike's attitude between the lip and the landing. A heavier bike with a wider engine package is less responsive to those inputs, which compresses the margin for error on every jump. Experienced riders could manage it, but managing a weight and geometry penalty isn't the same as having the right tool for the job. The AMA ban, killed before it could compete. This is the sentence that ends the American story before it starts. The AMA rulebook mandates single-cylinder engines for professional motocross competition. A V-twin didn't fit, and Aprilia wasn't going to get a waiver. The MXV sold in the US at $8,499, significantly more than a KTM 450 SXF, with no professional racing program to justify the premium and no AMA Pro Class, where it was eligible to compete. Motocross bikes sell because people see them race at the highest level. Without that platform, you don't have a marketing machine. You have an expensive curiosity. The sales numbers reflected that reality immediately. Josh Coppins and the last twin in GP motocross. The one place the MXV got to show what it could actually do under race conditions was the FIM Motocross World Championship. The MXGP rulebook didn't carry the same single-cylinder restriction as the AMA, and in 2010, New Zealand's Josh Coppins, a seasoned GP veteran who'd spent years at the front of the 450 class, raced the MXV for a full season. He finished 12th overall in the 450 World Championship. That result made the MXV450 the last twin-cylinder motorcycle ever raced in Grand Prix motocross, a footnote that will never be repeated now that every major federation has aligned on single-cylinder regulations. Coppins was direct about what the bike was, genuinely fast in the right conditions, with a power delivery he described as surprisingly good and a traction character that worked well on hardpack where the smooth power pulse could be exploited. He was equally direct about what it wasn't: reliable enough, clutch issues, starting problems, and small mechanical failures accumulated through the season in a sport where a single DNF can cost you 5 championship positions. The potential was visible. The execution wasn't complete. The reliability gap. The MXV's documented failure modes tell a story about a program that was still developing while it was already racing. The original Big Bang test bike blew a head gasket on its first day of testing. Not a great start for a bike that was supposed to challenge KTM. Clutch reliability became a recurring theme in Coppins' GP campaign. Starting issues, compounded by the kickstart-only configuration, which meant no electric start convenience when the engine was heat-soaked mid-race, created situations that a conventional single-cylinder competitor simply didn't face. The broader reliability picture was consistent with a racing program in its first 2 years of competition development, rather than a mature platform with a decade of race data behind it. KTM, Honda, and Yamaha had all made their catastrophic early reliability mistakes in the early 2000s, sorted them through factory racing programs, and arrived in 2009 with bulletproof engines. Aprilia was at the beginning of that learning curve, not the end of it. Why the program ended after 2 years? The MXV ran as a production model for 2009 and 2010, 2 model years before Aprilia pulled the plug. The commercial logic was impossible to make work. Banned from AMA professional competition, priced above the market's established leaders, heavier than the bikes it was competing against, and carrying the reputation cost of documented reliability issues in GP racing. The MXV had no clear path to the volume it needed to justify continued development investment. Aprilia's resources, engineering talent, racing budget, factory attention, were concentrated on road racing, where the RSV4 was about to launch a World Superbike Championship run that would define the brand for a generation. The off-road program couldn't compete with that internally for budget, and it couldn't compete with KTM externally for results. The MXV was discontinued and the program quietly closed. What it left behind. The MXV450 holds one permanent record. It was the last twin-cylinder motorcycle to race in the FIM Motocross World Championship. No bike will ever take that away from it. The concept it represented, smooth, configurable power, multiple ignition and fuel maps, a firing interval that managed traction differently than any single could, was genuinely ahead of where the market was in 2009. The tools Aprilia was reaching for, multiple maps, configurable power character, EFI tuning for traction management, are now standard on every competitive MX bike on the market. Aprilia just got there with the wrong engine architecture in a rulebook environment that made it impossible to compete at the professional level, at a moment when their own factory priorities were pointed somewhere else entirely. If the Aprilia story tells you anything, it's that building a competitive motocross machine from scratch is brutally expensive, even when you're a major manufacturer with a full racing division behind you. Aprilia couldn't make the numbers work with a 2-year program and a GP campaign. Now imagine what it actually costs to build a bike that wins Supercross championships. Not the production bike you can buy at a dealer. The real factory machine, custom titanium hardware, proprietary ECU mapping no privateer will ever access, suspension built specifically for one rider's weight and style, and a team of engineers who do nothing else but make that one bike faster. The next video breaks down every single reason a factory Supercross bike costs $200,000, and by the end of it, you'll understand why that number isn't even surprising.